Wow. Oh, wow, I like this crowd already. Hi, yes, as Ali said, I'm Dave Gilbert. It is amazing being back here. You have no idea how happy I am. The last speaking gig I gave was 3 years ago at AdventureX, so I'm a little out of practice, so this will be a great experience for all of us. Anyway, I call this talk Raise It or Restart It, how modular design saved old skies. So I'm going to be talking about modular design. But before I get into that, a bit about me for those who don't know. I'm a New Yorker. I lived there majority of my life. I was born there. Before I got into games, I was a boring 9-to-5 guy working in the garment center of Manhattan doing shipping, of all things. I escaped that in 2006. I started Wadjet, and then a few years later was joined by my wife Janet, who sadly has got one of those real programming jobs now. It doesn't really work with me anymore, but she still helps out quite a lot. And then by my daughter Eve in 2013, who hasn't quite learned to code yet, although she often pushes me by asking, is your game done yet? Is your game done yet? All the time. So, you know, she's already learned how to make daddy cry. Since our founding, we have, in addition to writing my own games, we've also published a bunch, and we've done 18, including the Blackwell series, Puzzlebots, Shiva, Resonance, Gemini Rue, Primordia, Golden Wake, New Guys, Shardlight, most recently Strangeland last year, and the year before that, Unavowed, and most recently, as of a month ago, the excavation of Hobbs Barrow, and leading ladies right in the front row, so say hello. And we have 2 more in the works. We're publishing a game called Nighthawks, a vampire visual novel type thing by Richard Cobbett, and Old Skies, right here, which is what I'm going to be talking about mostly today. It is a time travel type story. We tend to focus on point-and-click style adventure games, so narrative heavy, emphasis on story and narrative and character and all that stuff. So these are the things we're known for. It's what we tend to focus on. So 3 years ago, I gave a talk here at AdventureX at the old venue at the British Library. And the talk was about my struggles with writer's block and how I was trying to get through that while iterating on my next big idea, whatever that might be. And I finished that talk with some very optimistic words. And those words were, a year from now, at the next AdventureX, I will tell you how it all went. Yeah, that obviously didn't happen. I did not return the next year, and I did not return the following year either. But finally, 3 years later, I'm here to tell you how it all went. And also, one interesting thing about this time slot is usually they give me a half hour, but I've given 45 minutes today, so I'm just gonna take a second and just enjoy it and try to resist all my instincts and talk slow. And also, I ask you to, I did leave time for questions at the end. Please think of questions, because I don't want to stand here looking like a moron. Bit of a disclaimer before I start. There are 1,000,001 ways to tell a story. There are 1,000,001 ways to structure a story. And there are 1,000,001 ways to do modular design or modular narrative. So I can only talk about my own personal experiences working with this and my own projects and stuff. There are a lot of articles and books written about modular design. I'm not going to stand here rather, and regurgitate all of that. Although I would recommend a book, Character Development and Storytelling for Games by Lee Sheldon. Excellent book, little overpriced. But it reinforces a lot of what I'm going to be talking about. But again, nothing I say or anything anyone says, including maybe Lee Sheldon, should be taken as gospel. As I said, there are 1,000,001 ways to do anything. So again, all I can do is tell you my own experiences. And the feedback I've gotten from my own work and the work I publish. So as with anything, your mileage may vary. My lecture/talking style can best be described as basically I'm an idiot. I have no idea what I'm doing. I never have. How I've managed to make this work for over 16 years is a mystery to even me. But I will tell you what I did, and maybe by taking bits and pieces of that, you can apply it to your own processes and creative journeys and what have you. I personally find that I learn more by hearing personal stories, successes and failures, that kind of thing, rather than just getting a laundry list of things you should do. So basically, I'm going to be talking about myself a lot, so be prepared for that. So my story begins almost 3 years ago, January of 2020. I decided I wanted to write a time travel story, and I gave it the tentative name of Old Skies, the idea being you go back in time, they're older skies that you're looking at. I had this interesting idea that something had destroyed the world, and the only survivor was this woman named Fia who could time travel, and you had to travel to different eras to try and track down the sequence of events that led to the world ending, and you had to prevent it. Don't worry about spoilers because the game is no longer about that. More about that later. But I liked this idea, and I started putting together a little prototype. I wasn't sure where it was going, but I liked the idea. It called to me for some reason. So I kept going, and I decided the core theme of the game should be, the dangers of looking back at the past and relying on nostalgia and that kind of trap you fall into. And that seemed to be the core theme that connected me to this project. But then something happened a few months later that I'm sure we're all aware of. It's this guy again. Global pandemic hit. The world basically shut down. And suddenly this theme of the dangers of longing for the past started to feel a little hollow. For obvious reasons. I no longer wanted to be in the present. I found myself not liking this project much, and I found it very hard to get thoughts and design ideas out of my head and into a design document, let alone an actual game. And I don't want to discount anyone's experience during the pandemic. We all had our unique experiences, our own troubles, and all that during it. But for me, this was an absolutely agonizing time. As I said, I'm from New York. I live in New York City, which at the time was the epicenter of everything. We didn't dare go outside. And we had, at the time, a 6-year-old who is now 9. Wow, this has been going on a long time. And she needed homeschooling every day, and both my wife and I needed to work. It was always an argument about who got to work that day, big mess. So between that and the distractions of the world being on fire, I found myself hating everything I was working on. I hated this project. I started the year loving the idea. But now I hated every single waking minute of it. But I kept going because I thought that even though everything is miserable, there's your YouTube thumbnail right here. This is an optimistic talk, just bear with me. Even though everything is miserable, I realized I could probably be creating something transcendentally brilliant. Sorry for my voice. I was at the pub last night, and let's say mistakes were made. I could be creating something transcendentally brilliant, but I would still probably hate it. I hated everything I was working on. So I'm just going to plow and power right through it and hope that my 15, 16 years of experience and instinct would somehow kick in and get me through it, enable some kind of magic to happen, and the game would be okay. And that turned out not very well. If anyone here heard the term BioWare magic, you kind of know where this is going. But I never got there, obviously. I never felt connected to this project in the way that I felt connected to other projects that I had done in the past. This pandemic had just sucked all the love I ever had for it. And I was just convinced that the game sucked. But again, I just kept pushing on, because what else could I do? This was my livelihood. My family depended on this. I had to produce something. So the first 8 months of production and prototyping, I barely got past designing a prologue of the game. And the interesting thing about this prologue, at least in hindsight, is that it was a standalone story. So if you look back at the title of the talk, you can sort of see where I'm getting to this, and I'm slowly getting to the point. It was a standalone story that kind of set the scene and established the world. You played this time traveler who worked for an agency whose job was to bring paying clients into the past. And these clients wanted to change something or re-experience something, and you would help them do that. And make sure nothing goes wrong, which of course something does. And then at the end of this job, the big cataclysmic event would happen. And because she's got her time travel stuff, she is the only one who can really figure out what happened. But I could not get beyond that prologue. I developed that prologue, where you travel with the client to the past, and I managed to get that done reasonably quickly. And I say reasonably because, pandemic fast, which wasn't very fast. But I did manage to get that done. I managed to design it, I wrote the dialogue, and I encoded it, got the art done within a reasonable amount of time. But after that, I was completely stuck. Where do we go from here? I don't know. Everything in my head just felt horrible and wrong. And I was pushing it for months and months and months, and just hating it and not really getting anywhere, and seeing time fritter away. And then a bit of a saving grace came in the form of a game called Strangeland, a game that was pitched to me for publishing. It was practically complete. They just needed some final touches and marketing and voice acting and on all the stuff I usually do with a game that I publish. And I kind of welcomed the opportunity to not have to think about Old Skies for a while. So I was able to take a break from Old Skies, work on Strangeland, and then come back to Old Skies fresh. So I spent about 4 or 5 months on Strangeland. And once that was done and out, I came back to Old Skies to see if I still hated it. And I did. I totally still hated it. I was a bit beside myself at this point because I felt like I had wasted an entire year. And again, horrible year for everybody, but like I said, my livelihood. This is how I supported myself, my family, etc. If I couldn't get something out, we are screwed. This was not a good situation to be in. And the more stressed I got about it, the harder it was to focus on actually making the darn thing better. This is horrible negative feedback loop. So this was like a make or break moment. I had to decide fast whether this was worth pursuing, raise it or rebuild it. So I put the game in front of some people I trusted, a handful, just people who I knew could tell it to me straight, who could tell me if the game was salvageable or not, because I had some people who had more distance from it than I did. And they didn't really like it either. It wasn't terrible, they said, but the common feedback I got was, again, sorry for my voice. The common feedback I got was, this doesn't feel like something you would write. These are people who know my work and know how I generally like to structure and write things. And this was right in, oh my God, right in more ways than one, because I never felt like myself when I was writing it. And that was the final nail in the coffin for me. This was not working. I couldn't push this anymore. I either had to burn the thing to the ground and do something else entirely, or figure out what did make this work and start over from scratch with that in mind. But since I had been spinning my wheels for so long, I really needed to reevaluate how I worked. I needed to look at my previous work and try to figure out and deconstruct even how I was able to do this before. I had produced and written and designed so many times before, frequently, often relatively easily, at least compared to this, but not now. What was so different about all those other projects? Was it just the pandemic? I was not sure. I had worked under chaotic conditions before. I wrote the last Blackwell game when we had a child and moved 4 times. If I could manage that, I could manage this, so I thought. But I had never felt this level of dislike for my own work. So what was so different about my other projects? So I took some time and, like I said, deconstructed my own past work. Not just the games themselves, but the ways I approached each project as a designer. For many years, I just worked on pure instinct, but maybe there was some methodology that I was missing out on. And this was actually very interesting because I noticed a reoccurring pattern with the structure of most of my games. And this is a roundabout way of getting to the point and the title of the talk. Can you guess what kind of structure I'm talking about? Yes, it was a modular structure. So what is a modular structure? This is the boring, academic part of the talk, so bear with me. Essentially, how modular narrative structure works, and this is the case with any medium, not just video games, is that there is an overarching story or theme throughout an entire piece or body of work. But the majority of the work is made up or comprised of small standalone bits, stories, episodes, or modules, as the case may be. Hi. Oh, you are a rock star. Thank you so much. The best example of this in action is a season of television where there is often a big bad or a big reveal or a big theme or message that everything is slowly building toward. And the whole season is made up of individual episodes that mostly stand alone, but can loosely tie in or try to reinforce the bigger story that is being told. And that is the boring textbook definition of modular storytelling or modular narrative. And we see this in games all the time. Open world games, at least the good ones, are 90% this. As you wander through a world, you encounter smaller stories sprinkled throughout. And if they do their job well, all of these smaller stories really reinforce the world that you're in. Mid-era BioWare games, like from the original Knights of the Old Republic to like the second Mass Effect game whenever EA took over, they do this beautifully. Knights of the Old Republic, which is a game I replay every few years because it's brilliant. This is essentially just 7 modular stories, all kind of told in isolation, but they all reinforce how terrible the villain is and all the political stuff that's happening behind the scenes. And so when you finally encounter that villain, like you know everything about him and why he's terrible, even though you never really encountered him yourself. And this style of designing has many advantages, especially for a very large team, like a BioWare team. You can assign groups of writers to each individual module, so they can all work in tandem, separately from each other. And if you have a strong creative lead who can oversee all of these teams, it is a very efficient way, excuse me again, it is a very efficient way of creating a lot of content reasonably quickly because you have a number of different bits being worked on at the same time. But obviously I'm not a big team, I'm not BioWare, but it turns out this can also work well for small, dinky 1 or 2 or 3 person operation like mine. As I said, I wanted to go back and deconstruct myself and my old work. And not just the games themselves, but the process of making them. And I'm a little old school in that I would keep all my designs in notebooks, and I have a shelf full of them. Some of them are like 15, 20 years old. I never throw them away. But I took them down and I started looking through them. And it was a wonderful peek into the mind of past Dave, of my design processes with working on a lot of my older games. And the interesting thing about past Dave is that he didn't know what he was doing. He was really making it up as he went along, and somehow always managed to make it work. But again, how was I able to make it work then, but not now? The cornerstone of our catalog is a series called Blackwell, and I know I'm tempting fate, but how many of you have played Blackwell? Yes, all right, that's always a risky question to ask. If no one raises their hand, I would just leave. So, in a nutshell, Blackwell is a series about saving and helping ghosts. There are lost ghosts. They have their own problems and traumas that you need to solve and help them move on and so on to whatever's next. And when I was reading my old notebooks, I learned I had a very specific way that I wrote most of the Blackwell games. Whenever I sat down to write a Blackwell game, I would focus on the individual ghost stories first. And I wrote those in isolation. I knew there'd be a ghost. They'd have some kind of problem or some kind of trauma, and I knew you would have to save them somehow. And I would focus on that. I would design that story as just a standalone thing. And then I would do another one. And I would think, okay, how many ghost stories does this game need? 3, 4? Okay, so I would make 3 or 4 ghost stories. And in isolation, before I did anything else, before I determined what the backstory is, what the connecting tissue of all these stories were. But while I was working on these individual stories, that overarching story or theme or whatever would kind of percolate in the back of my head. And eventually, I could see this by looking through my notes, there'd be a light bulb moment, and I would see in my notes, oh, the game is about this. And once I had those, since I already had those stories written, I could go back and kind of connect everything up and adjust bits and pieces to kind of make everything consistent with the theme and the overarching story that surrounded it. Blackwell Deception is a great example of this. The main ghost stories, I realized as I was writing them, they involved characters that were subconsciously sabotaging their own happiness. And when I realized this connection, this is the theme here. Once I had that theme, I was able to tie it all together by creating this villain, this little creep named Gavin, and who embodied that theme, literally. He is someone who deliberately keeps people miserable and then sucks the unused happiness from them and uses that to extend his own life, a kind of spiritual vampire. And through this character, I was able to really explore that theme a little deeper. And so I created the villain based on the themes of the modules I had created. So basically, here's how it works. The individual stories came first. Then I found the connection between those stories. And that connection now is my theme. And so I could take that theme and use that to create the overarching story that supported all of those stories. And I want to say again, I did not approach these projects with this method in mind. I'm not that smart. I just kind of fell into this way of working accidentally. As I was analyzing my past work and deconstructing it and realizing I used to work this way, my first reaction was, this is kind of backward, isn't it? It feels weird. It's a weird way of writing, a weird way of designing, a weird way of storytelling. Usually you start with the theme, right? But it worked. It worked. I can't deny it worked. Breaking up each project into smaller, standalone bits totally worked. At least it worked for me. As I said, your mileage may vary. There is no feeling in the world like completing something, completing a task or whatever. You get that dopamine hit to the brain where it makes you feel really good, and you just go, yeah, I did that. And that's the advantage of working this way, working modularly. Most of the games I've written, especially the higher regarded ones, and not coincidentally, the ones I had the most fun writing, were all designed in this episodic, modular way. It took the colossal task of write the whole game and broke it up into smaller, more manageable tasks. Short-term goals that were less daunting to achieve than make a whole game. Each individual bit felt like a small and complete game or project in and of itself. Something where I could finish it and be like, yes, I did that bit. And I had that regular feedback loop in my brain, that dopamine hit of satisfaction whenever I finished one of these small chunks. Because each of these bits was its own story. It had a beginning, middle, and an end. It was a complete thing. And that's what got me through all these other projects. Every project I worked on, I had that regular satisfaction. I did this bit. Yes, okay, now I'm on to the next one. And I didn't know it. I didn't know at the time I was working that way. But now I did know that. So going back to Old Skies, now the reason for this block was obvious. I wasn't doing any of that for Old Skies. I wasn't playing to my strengths or design instincts or sensibilities. I was trying to make a game where I was holding the entire story in my head before I could even begin creating it. I never got those little moments of satisfaction. The game was just one big module. I wouldn't get that dopamine hit until I finished the damn thing. It was just one big bit, not made up of little bits. So of course, this was a slog. Of course I hated working on it, in addition to the pandemic and all of that. It was the antithesis, is that the word? There are academics here who will yell at me later, of every design methodology I had ever been using up until that point. And again, I didn't even realize I was doing it. So this was a big eye-opener, epiphany moment for me. Wow, okay, so that's how I worked, and that's how I was always able to achieve stuff. So what now? With all these newfound realizations about myself and my work methods, I had to return to my original question. Do I burn it down? Or do I rework what I already have? I'm a bit esoteric. I Googled the word esoteric and this came up. So that's what esoteric is right there. Google doesn't lie. I'm a bit esoteric when it comes to the creative process. If you've heard my talks and seen me on Twitter, you know this to be true. And as was made painfully clear during my experiences over 2020, I am not someone who can just sit down and do creative work when I'm not feeling connected to it. I believe we are all moved to create things for a reason, whether we're aware of it or not. I wanted to create a time travel story. Something about that idea appealed to me, but I never stopped to think, why? What was it about a time travel? What is it about time travel or a time travel story that appealed to me back then? Or more specifically, what made me want to create a time travel story? And so, I took a look at what I had actually created. Not the game that was in my head, not the game I was hoping to make, not the non-existent game that could potentially exist, but the thing that I had actually created, what I actually had written down, programmed, and then you can actually play. What had actually managed to come out of me. And that was the prologue. This bit where you take a client into the past. I was able to write that relatively quickly and kind of easily, as I said. And yet, beyond that point, I remained completely blocked. And the question was still, why? Now that I had analyzed myself, the answer was obvious. The story I had actually written, not the epic story of saving the world, but the more human story of time travelers wanting to re-experience the past, to change something or observe something, that longing for something in the past. That was the bit I had written. That was the bit that really appealed to me. And it's obvious that was the case because that's the bit I was actually able to make. that was the story I wanted to tell. And not just that story, but many stories using this concept. And when I realized this, my brain was kind of buzzing. I was really excited. I could wrap so many stories around this relatively simple concept, meaning I could make it modular. So I was really excited by this. This new realization and this new direction to take this game. And over the course of the next several weeks, I just started doing some quick and dirty outlining for potential stories that I could wrap this concept around. I wanted to keep these stories relatively short. Every time you walk up, I keep thinking you're telling me time is up. So I'm like, should I? All right, I'm going to keep going. All right. I wanted to keep these stories relatively short and personal. I didn't want to make big epic stories. I wanted to make them personal. I loosened up the constraints of time travel to give myself room to tell any story I basically wanted. And it's been kind of amazing. I'm loving my work again. It's 2 years later and I'm still loving it. I come to my computer or my design notebook every day and I leave it smiling. I mean, some days are better than others because it's still a job, but it's a far cry from 2 years ago where everything I was writing felt like pulling my teeth out. But now I really like what I'm doing. And so this would normally be the point where I say, I will come back next year and hopefully tell you how it went. But two things. Number one, I don't want to jinx it. And number two, I just want to say, and this is getting a little esoteric. For every AdventureX, almost within its existence, I have been given this amazing gift of kind of given a slot during the conference where I could speak about anything I wanted. No submission. They just said, just come and speak. And it's been kind of incredible to be given that opportunity, and I'm so grateful for it. AdventureX has been just a wonderful part of my life. I feel like professionally, personally, everything, I've grown so much during that. But we agreed that the event has gotten big enough that like we don't need to do that anymore. So this will be my last talking gig at AdventureX for at least a couple of years. I will have to submit and get approved like the rest of you. But again, thank you. So thank you, Tom and Allie and everyone involved for really, it's been a gift. It's been really wonderful. But anyway, that is how modular design helped me get my groove back, basically. I hope this was helpful to you. It was helpful to me. So again, I won't be back next year to talk about it, but if you want to reach out to me, here are all my social media things, assuming Twitter is still around a year from now. Feel free to drop me a line. I am very online. I'm easy to find. So with that, thank you. Yeah.
And we have time for a few questions. Would everyone like to ask a question?
Oh, good.
Dave.
Someone's raised their hand, thank God.
Right at the back. Great. I love it when it's at the back.
Hi. You've talked about what went wrong in your design process for Old Skies, but do you have any idea how you fell into that trap and what you can do to prevent that happening again in the future?
I think what went wrong, as I said, the big problem was that I wasn't feeling emotionally connected to what I was making. It was this big, esoteric story of you must save the world, and my original plan was, okay, you go to all these different eras, and you'd have like these Day of the Tentacle style puzzles that all interconnect, and you would get through the game that way. But the problem is that, again, I couldn't really work in small chunks. I had to really hold the entire game in my head and be really careful about designing and careful plotting before I could even put things together. Because I can't just start programming and prototyping because this connects to something later. I need to design that as well, so this will be ready for it to connect later. And that kind of stress just really slowed things down. And not seeing the steady progress kind of made me feel very negative about the game. which made it harder to work on the game, which made it take even longer. I probably would have gotten there eventually, but I would not have enjoyed it, and it would have been a much worse game. So that was really the trap. I kind of talked about this already, but I said how everyone's drawn to create something for a reason. And often the trap you can fall into is not knowing why. Like, oh, I want to make a superhero story. But okay, what is it about superhero? What is the story you want to tell? What is it about a superhero story that is making you want to write a superhero story? Not because superheroes are cool. Like, yeah, superheroes are cool, but what is it like, you have to, why do you want to make a superhero story? Why did I want to tell a time travel story? And I want to use it to explore these ideas. I didn't realize that at the time. And it took a long time for me to figure that out. And I am glad I got there in the end. Hopefully that answers your question.
More questions for Dave? I can see.
Yeah, I see lots of hands.
Hello.
Hi.
Thanks so much for explaining. And I think it's really cool that you went back to your original instincts and trusted yourself in that way. There was a method to the madness. I'm wondering if through that process, so after the focusing on the individual stories, find the connection between them, then creating that into the theme of the game, whether you found a pattern in how you then created the overarching story, at the end, whether there was a particular pattern where it was like, okay, there's a villain in everyone who's going to embody
in terms of
the
overarching,
theme.
do you mean over the whole series or that specific game?
Any of the specific games, like how you actually went about uniting the modules, not just by theme, but embodying the theme in an overarching story.
Are you thinking just like how specifically how I connected it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's easy to say, oh, and then I connected them, but I never really explained how I did that. I mean, usually it's there's no real right or wrong answer. I mean, typically it's like I say, okay, using Blackwell Deception again, I realized these characters were sabotaging their own happiness. And when I created this character of Gavin, so obviously he had to be involved in these other ghost stories somehow. He was encouraging it, and so okay, these characters obviously had problems. They were seeing, I don't want to spoil anything. So they basically I managed to shoehorn him into their lives. He had to encourage it somehow, and so over the course of investigating them, you learn about him through them. And often the biggest critique of most of my games is that the overarching story tends to be a little on the weak side, and that's probably the reason, is because I would always do that last. Like, okay, here's these like great individual stories, and then there's a kind of a tenuous connection between them, and I own that, and that's because that's the way I worked. And with Old Skies, I figured I have found a connecting, overarching story, and I'm kind of in the works of writing it and incorporating it. But if it doesn't work, at the very least, I have 6 or 7 really solid individual stories that I think are really good. And if that's the game, then that's fine too. So I'm happy either way. Either way, the important thing is, at the end of the day, I have to get something out. So not everything can be perfect. So I connect them as best I can, and I say, okay, hopefully this works. Enjoy. And more often than not, my instincts have been more right than wrong.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hey, this is maybe kind of more conceptual. I'm wondering, like, the way that you're talking about your games as modules, do you find like any friction or any like patterns that you sort of fall into when you're thinking about this sort of modular design? Like, I imagine it really suits the genre, right? For like linear sort of things. The player does this stuff in this module and this stuff in this module. But what about games where, the player might have this gameplay in module 1, or it might be in module 2. The modules are within modules. Does the metaphor break down? What do you think?
I'm afraid I'm not quite understanding the question.
Well, just I think like with any like, this is my pattern for designing games. There's probably like patterns we fall into, and like I imagine this modular design really works for linear games. Do you have any thoughts about like does this work for other types of games, breaking stuff down into modules? What are the drawbacks about thinking?
I mean, I don't know how to answer that question. I mean, it can work. Basically, if, like I said, this is how it works for me. I've played games where like everything is wonderfully interconnected over a game that lasts like 9 or 10 hours. That's not me. Like I can't hold all that in my head. So by breaking it up, I'm able to like make it easier for myself. So I can't speak to how it would work for other games or other genres because this is just specifically how I do things, or how well it's worked for me. So I don't want to answer the question and steer you wrong. So
I think we've got time for one more.
Yeah, I'll make it quick. Very interested in what you said because I'm really interested in processes. How long do the units that you work, the modules that you work on, how long does each module take? And then do you, roughly, and then do you break down those modules into smaller units?
oh my God.
Sorry for a really precise question.
I mean, there's a reason why this game is taking me so long. There's no rhyme or reason. I mean, like, there's this one bit of Old Skies that takes place in the 1870s. Took me 7 months. This one I'm working on now, I'm almost finished designing it. I did it in 2. There's no, like, the problem with when you're creating something and you're trying to make a schedule for yourself, it's easy to say once you know what you're making, okay, I need to make this and this and this, and you have a checklist. But when it's like you have to come up with the thing you're making, you're pulling it out of wherever the universe, wherever ideas are coming from. And it's very hard to put a timetable on that. I've gained a lot of respect for folks like TV writers or whatever who have to write and create on a schedule. So even when there's like a bad episode of a television show, I still respect them because they had to get something out that day. So here's what it is. I have the luxury of not having to make something I'm not happy with. So I usually take as long as I want, as long as there's still money in the bank. So, yeah, it varies.
I'm afraid that is the end. Please join me in saying a big thank you to Dave Gilbert.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.